Abigail Reyes stood in the doorway of the county clerk's office with her hands shaking so hard the marriage license nearly slipped to the floor. Behind the counter, Wyatt Sullivan hadn't moved in almost a full minute. He just looked at her, the way a man looks at a rattlesnake he isn't sure is dead yet. "Say that again," he said. "I said I want to marry you." Abigail's voice cracked on the last word, but she didn't look away. "Before Sunday, if the clerk will do it." Somewhere behind her, out on the boardwalk of Larned, Kansas, a wagon wheel creaked past. A dog barked twice and went quiet. The town went on about its business, unaware that inside this small brick office, a woman had just handed her whole future to the one man nobody in 3 counties would touch. Wyatt set down his pen. He was 34 years old, built like a man who'd spent a decade doing work that broke other men by 25. A scar ran from his left ear to his jaw, pale and old, the kind of mark that got its own rumors. Some said a Comanche blade, some said a jealous husband, some said worse. Nobody asked him directly. Nobody wanted the answer badly enough to risk it. Abigail Reyes was 26, unmarried, and running out of a particular kind of time that women in 1877 Kansas understood without needing it explained. Her father's dry goods store was failing. 2 bad harvests had emptied the county of buyers, and the bank in Great Bend had already sent 1 letter about the debt attached to the family's land. She had exactly 1 asset left that mattered to anyone: herself, and the 80 acres that would come with her when she married. Every eligible man within a day's ride had made it clear he'd take the land and leave the debt behind, and take her along as a formality he could tolerate. Every man except one had also made it clear, in ways large and small, that Wyatt Sullivan's name was not to be spoken kindly in polite company. Which was exactly why she was standing in his doorway. "You don't know me," Wyatt said. "I know enough. You know what people say." He picked the pen back up, mostly to have something to do with his hands. "That's not the same thing. If you've ever had to bet everything on a stranger, you already know the feeling sitting in Abigail's chest right now. Stay with her, because this one's going to test what she's really made of." "People said my father would go bankrupt within a year of opening his store," Abigail said. "That was 9 years ago. People also said Ellen Marsh would never walk again after her fall, and she danced at her own wedding 18 months later. I don't marry rumors, Mr. Sullivan. I looked at the ledger, and I looked at you, and I made a decision." The ledger. A muscle moved in his jaw. "So this is business. Everything out here is business. Even love, when people are being honest about it." She set the license down on the counter between them, careful, like she was placing a bet she couldn't take back. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to consider it. There's land. There's a roof that doesn't leak yet, and there's a debt I can't clear alone." Wyatt looked down at the paper without touching it. 3 years ago, he had ridden into Larned with a string of horses, $41, and a reputation that arrived a full day before he did. Nobody remembered exactly who started the story about the man from the Nations who'd killed his own trail boss over a card game. Nobody remembered because it didn't matter who started it. Once a story like that took root in a small town, it grew, whether it was true or not, and correcting it only fed it. Wyatt had learned that the first month. After that, he'd stopped correcting anything. He ran the livery on the edge of town now. He paid his debts on time. He went to church twice a year, at Christmas and at Easter, and sat in the back pew and left before anyone had to decide whether to shake his hand. Women crossed the street. Men nodded at him the way you'd nod at weather you couldn't control. He had told himself, more than once, that he'd made his peace with being the thing this town needed to be afraid of. It gave people somewhere to put their nerves. It was, in its own way, a kind of usefulness. He had not told himself what to do if someone walked in and refused to be afraid. "Your father know you're here?" he asked. "No." "Your brother?" "He'd stop me if he did." "Smart brother." Something flickered across Abigail's face. Not quite a smile, not quite hurt. She'd practiced this conversation on the ride into town, rehearsed a dozen versions of how it might go, and none of them had him being gentle about turning her down. She had braced for cruelty. She hadn't braced for this. A man who looked more tired than dangerous, more careful than cold. "I'm not asking because I'm desperate for just anyone," she said, quieter now. "I've had 2 other offers this month. Better land, better standing, no whispering when the man walks into a room. I turned them both down." "Why?" She hesitated, and for the first time since she'd walked in, her eyes dropped to the counter. "Because I watched you 3 weeks ago," she said, "at the Hendricks place. Their boy's horse went down in the creek crossing, and everyone stood on the bank talking about how to get a rope out there, and you were already in the water before anyone finished the sentence. You didn't say a word to anyone after. You just handed the boy back to his mother and rode off before she could thank you." Wyatt's face didn't change, but his hand had gone still on the counter. "That's not nothing to build a marriage on," he said finally. "1 creek." "No, but it's a start, and I don't have the luxury of waiting for a better one." Outside, the courthouse clock struck the half-hour, and somewhere down the street a woman's voice called a child in for supper. Wyatt looked at the license one more time, then at Abigail. Really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look at anyone in 3 years. Because looking too long at people usually ended with them looking away first. She didn't look away. "I need until tomorrow," he said. It wasn't yes. It wasn't the 4 words she'd been half expecting, half dreading. The ones that would end this before it started. But it wasn't no either. And for a woman who'd walked in with nothing left to lose, that small space between refusal and agreement felt like the widest room she'd stood in for a year. She picked the license back up, folded it once, and held it against her chest like something fragile. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She turned to go, and had her hand on the door when his voice stopped her. "Miss Reyes." She turned back. Wyatt Sullivan stood there in the gray afternoon light coming through the office window. A man built out of other people's fear, looking at her like he was trying to solve something that didn't have a clean answer. "Nobody's ever walked toward me first," he said. "Not once. Not in 3 years." He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. Abigail felt the words settle somewhere under her ribs, and she walked out into the street without another word. Because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't ruin it. Behind her, through the window, Wyatt Sullivan stood alone in the empty office, staring at the door long after it had closed, one hand pressed flat against the counter like he was checking whether it was still solid ground. 3 days after Abigail left the courthouse, the answer came. Not in words, but in the shape of a wagon. Wyatt Sullivan pulled up outside the Reyes place just after sunrise, a crate of tools and a bedroll in the back, and said nothing to her father except, "I'll take the license today, if she's still willing." Her father, Manuel Reyes, stood on the porch in his nightshirt, with a shotgun he didn't raise and didn't put down either. "You'll take my daughter's name and my daughter's land," Manuel said. "What do I get?" "The debt's paid within the year," Wyatt said. "That's all I can promise you that's worth promising." It wasn't tenderness. It wasn't the kind of proposal Abigail had imagined as a girl, back when she still imagined such things. But it was solid, and out here, solid counted for more than most men understood. They married that Thursday in the front room of the county clerk's office, the same room where she'd first asked him. 2 witnesses, the clerk's wife and a livery hand named Purdy, stood in for a church full of guests neither of them had. Abigail wore her mother's blue dress, let out at the seams. Wyatt wore a clean shirt and the same careful, unreadable face he'd worn the day she walked in. When the clerk asked if anyone objected, the room stayed silent a beat too long, like even the walls were waiting to see if the town's fear would walk through the door and stop it. It didn't. Nobody came. If you've ever made a decision everyone around you quietly disapproved of, you know that particular kind of silence. Stay close, because Abigail's about to learn what it costs. That night, Wyatt showed her to the small house behind the livery. 2 rooms, a stove, a bed he'd clearly built himself out of rough pine, still smelling of sawdust. "I'll sleep in the barn," he said, "until you're used to things." "This is my house now, too," Abigail said. "You don't have to sleep in a barn in your own home." "I know what I have to do," Wyatt said. "This isn't it." He left before she could argue further, and she lay awake that first night listening to the town settle around her. Dogs, wind through the cottonwoods, the low creak of a building that wasn't quite home yet, and wondered exactly what kind of bargain she'd made. The whispering started within a week. At the Mercantile, women who'd known Abigail since she was a girl in pigtails suddenly found reasons to examine bolts of cloth very closely when she walked in. Mrs. Talbot, who ran the boarding house, asked her outright, not unkindly, but not gently either, whether she slept with one eye open. "He's never given me a reason to," Abigail said. "Give him time," Mrs. Talbot said, and went back to her mending. Abigail didn't tell Wyatt about these conversations. She didn't need to. He could read it in the way the barber's boy still crossed the street to avoid the livery, in the way the preacher's handshake stayed a half-second shorter than it should have been. He said nothing about it. He simply worked. Dawn until dark, shoeing horses, mending harness, hauling feed, and came home each night with dust on his boots, and said little beyond what needed saying. But Abigail began to notice things. The wood box was always full before she thought to ask. The well rope was replaced before it frayed through. Small repairs appeared around the house, like a ghost had made them. A loose hinge fixed, a window that used to stick, now gliding smooth. "You don't have to do all this," she told him one evening, watching him patch a gap in the porch step. "I know how to fix things," he said. "It's easier than talking." "Is that why you never say much?" He looked up at her, and for a moment something almost like humor crossed his face. "I say plenty. Just not to people who've already decided what I am before I open my mouth." "I haven't decided," Abigail said. "No," he agreed slowly. "You haven't." That's the strange part. 3 weeks into the marriage, the debt collector from the bank in Great Bend rode into town. A thin man named Kessler, with wire spectacles and a ledger under his arm, sent to assess whether the Reyes payments would actually materialize or whether foreclosure proceedings should begin. He found Wyatt at the livery and made the mistake of assuming the reputation meant the man couldn't read a contract. "I'll need to speak with your wife's father," Kessler said. "Directly. About the terms." "You'll speak with me," Wyatt said. "It's my name on the payments now." Kessler hesitated, glancing at the scar, the set of the shoulders, weighing rumor against the numbers in his ledger. "There's been talk," Kessler said carefully, "about whether this household can be relied on to make good." Wyatt didn't raise his voice. He never did. He simply set down the horseshoe he'd been shaping and looked at Kessler with a stillness that made the smaller man take an involuntary step back. "Talk doesn't pay debts," Wyatt said. "Money does. You'll have your first payment by the 15th. Tell your bank that, and tell them nothing else, because nothing else is their business." Kessler left without pressing further, and word of the exchange made its way back to Abigail before supper, carried by Purdy, who'd watched the whole thing with something close to awe. "He didn't even raise his hand," Purdy told her. "Didn't have to." That night, Abigail found Wyatt in the barn instead of coming in for supper, still working by lantern light on a bridle that didn't strictly need mending. "You didn't have to defend me to Kessler," she said. "The debt is my family's, not yours." "You married me," Wyatt said, not looking up. "That makes it mine now, too." "Even though marrying me is what's making all of this harder for you?" The talk was already there," he said, "before you. It'll be there after, whatever happens between us." He finally set the bridle down. "At least now it's talk about something I chose." Abigail stood in the doorway of the barn, lantern light throwing long shadows across the hay-strewn floor, and felt something shift in her chest that she wasn't ready to name yet. Not quite trust, not quite the beginning of something warmer, but close enough to both that it frightened her more than the whispering ever had. "Wyatt," she said, "why did you say yes? That day at the clerk's office. You had until morning to refuse me, and you didn't." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Because you didn't flinch," he finally said. "Everyone in this town has flinched at me at least once. You walked in and set a marriage license on the counter like you were placing an order for feed." A faint, tired, almost smile. "I wanted to see what a life looked like with someone who didn't." "And now? Now that you've seen a few weeks of it?" Wyatt picked the lantern up, and for a moment the light caught something unguarded in his face. Something he usually kept locked well behind the careful stillness he wore like armor. "Now," he said, "I'm starting to worry about what happens, if you ever do." He walked past her out of the barn without waiting for a response, leaving Abigail standing alone with the smell of hay and lamp oil. Turning his words over like a coin she couldn't decide whether to spend. 2 days later, a rider came into town asking questions about Wyatt Sullivan. The same questions, it seemed, that had followed him for 3 years. Except this rider wasn't idle. He was looking for something specific, and he wasn't from Larned at all. The rider's name was Cole Whitfield, and he didn't dismount when he reached the livery. He sat his horse in the yard, studying Wyatt with the particular patience of a man who'd been paid to find someone and didn't intend to leave empty-handed. "You're a hard man to track down," Whitfield said. "Took me the better part of 3 years." Wyatt set down the rasp he'd been using on a gelding's hoof, slow and deliberate. "You've got the wrong Sullivan," he said. "I don't think I do." Whitfield reached into his coat, and Wyatt's whole body went still in a way Abigail, watching from the house window, had never seen before, not even with Kessler. "Relax. It's a letter, not a gun." He tossed it down. Wyatt caught it without looking away from the rider's hands. "Your trail boss," Whitfield said. "Elias Byrne. Man you supposedly murdered over cards outside Dodge City 3 years back." "I know who he was." "He's alive," Whitfield said. "Been alive the whole time. Drunk himself half to death in Abilene, but alive. Fell off his horse that night, not off the wrong end of your knife. Story got twisted somewhere between the saloon and the next town, and by the time anyone thought to check, you'd already ridden off carrying the blame for a killing that never happened. Wyatt didn't move. Behind him, Abigail had come out onto the porch, close enough to hear, and something in her chest went very quiet. "Why, come tell me now," Wyatt said. 3 years late. "Burn's dying. Liver's given out. Wanted it set right before he goes. Sent me to find you. Get a signed statement. Make sure the truth's on record somewhere. Guilt does strange things to a man at the end." Whitfield studied him. "You could have told people the truth yourself, any time these 3 years. Why didn't you?" Wyatt looked down at the letter in his hands for a long moment before he answered. "Told the truth once. First month I was here," he said. "Nobody wanted to hear it. Story they already had was more interesting." He folded the letter once. After a while, a man gets tired of arguing with something that isn't listening. Whitfield shrugged, unbothered, already turning his horse. "Statement's all I needed. Do what you want with the truth now. That part's yours." He rode out the way he'd come, and the yard went quiet except for the gelding shifting its weight and the wind moving through the cottonwoods along the creek. Abigail crossed the yard slowly. "Wyatt?" He was still looking at the letter. 3 years, he said. 3 years I let this town believe I was a man who killed his own trail boss over a hand of cards, because it was easier than fighting a story that had already made up its mind. He laughed, short and without much humor in it. And the whole time I half believed it myself. Thought maybe if enough people say a thing about you, it becomes true whether it happened or not. "It didn't become true," Abigail said. "It was never true. You know that now." "Do I?" He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, something in his face had come completely undone. Not anger, not the careful stillness, just a man standing in his own yard holding proof that 3 years of his life had been built on a lie he'd let stand because arguing felt pointless. "I don't know what to do with this." "You could start," Abigail said gently, "by telling me why you never told me. Not the truth about Burn. I mean, why you let me marry a man everyone believed was a killer, without once saying it wasn't so." Wyatt was quiet a long moment. "Because you were the first person who didn't ask," he said. "You never once asked me if the story was true. You just decided I was worth the risk regardless. I didn't want to spend that on convincing you of something you'd already stopped needing to know." Abigail felt her eyes sting and didn't bother hiding it. "I need to know now," she said. "Not for me. For you." "You've carried this long enough." That evening, Wyatt Sullivan did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He walked into the center of town, letter in hand, and knocked on the preacher's door, and asked if he could speak to the congregation come Sunday. The church was fuller than usual that week, curiosity having done what 3 years of quiet decency never could. Wyatt stood at the front in his one clean shirt, Abigail beside him, and read Elias Byrne's letter aloud in a voice that didn't shake nearly as much as he'd expected it to. Nobody clapped. Nobody apologized outright either. That wasn't the way of a town like Larned. But Mrs. Talbot nodded once, slow, like a debt being marked paid. The barber's boy stopped crossing the street after that. Kessler, on his next visit from Great Bend, shook Wyatt's hand without being asked to. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It was something closer to a town quietly agreeing to start over. That night, walking home from church under a sky gone deep purple at the edges, Wyatt stopped at the gate of the little house behind the livery. The house he'd built with his own hands, and still, out of old habit, treated like it belonged more to her than to him. "I'll move my things in from the barn," he said, "if you'll still have me. Not because of the debt or the land or anything you're owed. Because I'd like to stay." "You already stayed," Abigail said. "Every night you slept 40 feet away instead of leaving altogether. I noticed." "That's not the same as choosing to stay." "No," she agreed, stepping closer. Close enough that the porch lantern threw both their shadows into one long shape against the wall. "It isn't." He reached up, slow, careful, like he was still half expecting her to flinch even now, and touched the side of her face, the way a man touches something he's afraid might not be real. She didn't flinch. She never had. "Nobody's ever walked toward me first," he said again, quieter this time. "Except you. Twice now." "Get used to it," Abigail said. "I intend to keep doing it." He kissed her then, on the porch step he'd fixed the week before, under a sky full of early stars, and somewhere behind them in the barn, the gelding shifted and settled, and the whole town of Larned, Kansas slept on, unaware that the man they'd feared for 3 years had finally, fully, come home. 8 months later, Abigail stood in the same doorway of the county clerk's office, one hand resting against the small curve of her stomach, waiting for Wyatt to finish signing the papers that cleared the last of her father's debt. He looked up, caught her eye through the window, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, he smiled. Open, unguarded, entirely his own, before crossing the room to take her hand and walk her out into the bright Kansas afternoon.